Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Hello and welcome to the end of Passover and Easter edition of Walter's World. It's April the 6th, 2021, and in our calendar, the 24th of Nisan, 5781. Today we're talking about the Biden border madness and other American peculiarities. Also in the program is an assessment of the American trial of the century. What caused the death of George Floyd? And I bring you a political commentary that I made several years ago. You can judge whether it still applies today. But I begin with the comments about Israel's fourth general election within 2 years, and the question, who will be able to form the next government? Will it again be Netanyahu, or does the president believe that Yair Lapid will have the best chance? But more importantly, will we have a stable government that lasts for 4 years, or again a makeshift coalition that will fall apart within months? I believe it will be well into May until we know definitively. Now that the fourth election result is official, rumors galore are being published about who is consulting with whom and what are the smaller parties demanding to join one or the other coalition. In fact, the post-election horse trading is as hectic as the period of negative canvassing that we all experienced. One thing is clear. Neither Netanyahu has the required 61 mandates to form a right-wing government, even if Bennett Yamina would join him. And up to now, he's keeping his cards very close to his chest. Nor does the opposing centre-left coalition led by Lapid have the necessary numbers. And they are hoping that Mansour Abbas of the Arab Ram party would join them. But he too is not committing himself, but waiting to see where he can get the best deal for his Arab constituents. Following the recommendations to the president by each of the parties elected to the Knesset, it is now up to President Rivlin to charge one of the party leaders with forming a government within 28 days, with the possibility of granting a 14-day extension if and only if he believes that a result is possible. In case of failure, the president would give another Knesset member the same opportunity to form a government, and should he or she also fail, the choice passes to the Knesset, who is unlikely to reach a positive result, and that may trigger another election in October.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Welcome back. So, if neither the president's nor the Knesset's efforts lead to a positive result, that may trigger another election in October. It is probable that one of the party leaders will succeed in forming a government that would include an Arab party, despite declarations that this would never come to pass. Such a situation would necessitate, for the first time, to offer one or two specially created ministerial posts to Arabs. It's been rumored that Netanyahu is considering Ahmed Tibi, former political advisor to Yasser Arafat, for such a position. He would, of course, do anything to remain in power and possibly escape prosecution. Netanyahu repeatedly insisted on being totally innocent. Would it therefore not stand to reason that if he is so firmly convinced that the indictments are based on ulterior motives of his opposition, he should stand trial and clear his name? Before the election, Netanyahu let it be known that he had no intention of forming a government with Arab parties, specifically with the Ram party led by Mansour Abbas. Netanyahu's Likud party published a statement which categorically refuted the allegation that they might agree to sit in a government with any Arab party after they opposed the Abraham Accords. Beware Netanyahu's words. He never means what he says. His rhetoric and that of the Likud party is vastly different from their policies. Remember his election day video 6 years ago when he warned that the Arabs are turning out in droves to vote, implying that their parties constitute a danger to Israel's security? He also suggested to install cameras in Arab voting centers to prevent their voter fraud. After this year's election, in order to secure his continued premiership, he is prepared to turn 180 degrees and form a government with the Arab Ram party, led by Mansour Abbas. But to form a workable coalition government, he would also need the support of the religious parties, and it's doubtful, however, if they would sit in a government with the Arabs. Last Wednesday morning, President Rivlin received the final results of the 2021 general election from the head of the election committee, Judge Uzi Vogelmann. Yesterday, April 5th, the party leaders began to visit the president at his residence to pass their recommendation for prime minister. When that is completed, the president will, for the 5th time during his term in office, announce his decision, and the process that I explained a moment ago will begin. Here are some of President Rivlin's remarks when he received the results. The main consideration that will guide me in selecting a candidate to entrust with forming a government is the chance of the selected Knesset member to form a government that will secure the confidence of the Knesset. A government that will heal the divisions between us and rebuild Israeli society, which has suffered such a grievous blow because of the coronavirus pandemic. Israeli society needs a government that will pass a budget, that will lead a process where the symptoms of the citizens who have been harmed are made better, and where the institutions of the state are rescued from the political stalemate that we found ourselves in precisely at the time when Israeli citizens need them more than ever. I truly hope, said the President, that the elected officials, representatives of the public, are able to hear the Israeli people and their call for out-of-the-ordinary coalitions, collaborations that cross sectors, working in a serious and dedicated way for the good of all of Israel's citizens. The political crisis that is shaking us is harming and weakening our democracy to a certain extent, but it will not beat us. We are stronger than that. Israeli society is stronger than that. The President's appeal to the elected officials is falling on deaf ears. The accusations and counter-accusations between them are getting stronger as it becomes clear that neither right nor left can as yet see possible success to form a government. Naftali Bennett is accusing Yair Lapid of being intent to form a left-wing government with the Arab parties, despite their conditions demanding legalization of the rogue Bedouin settlements in the Negev that affect the security of the Jewish state. Yet it has just been announced that Bennett is having talks with Mansour Abbas of the Ram party. It seems that Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who heads the Blue and White Party, is consulting with Lapid in order to remove Netanyahu. Of course, it's very early in the proceedings, and in Israel, policies and alliances change with the chances of the major players to gain ministerial posts, rather than with the aims that they loudly pronounce to form a stable government. As in the past, it's also quite likely that in order to entice the smaller parties to join either coalition, unnecessary ministerial posts will be created, making a much larger than necessary cabinet. We have experienced before that as government expands, liberty contracts, because every minister will want to expand his powers. At this point, I'd like you to hear my edited political commentary from many years ago and see if it still applies today. Then write to me with your views to walter@israelnewstalkradio.com, where you will always get my personal reply. It incorporates part of an article written by Simon Jacobson.
When media headlines are consumed with not even an attempt at analyzing Palestinians playing football with the head of an Israeli soldier, you know that something is seriously wrong. And this is by no means an anomaly. This has become a tragic constant in our times. Muslims are today committing atrocities against civilians on a sustained and ongoing basis, with very little global uproar. There's virtually no demand that Muslim countries protest and once and for all eradicate this campaign of terror. With all the news streaming from the Middle East, this fact is so accepted that it's only mentioned in passing, if at all. You don't read analyses, investigations, probes, endless commentary, as you do about Israel's activities or other far smaller matters. You don't hear any journalists trying to understand what type of environment is breeding citizens who brutalize innocent people and do so in the name of God. Do beheadings and other atrocities against innocent civilians in the name of so-called holy war fall outside the Geneva Convention? Or does that convention only cover cruel treatment of suspected terrorists and prisoners? That, of course, is a rhetorical question. Incidentally, Geneva Convention seems quite ironic coming from Switzerland, the not-so-neutral country during World War II, telling us that brutalizing civilians isn't acceptable, a country that has sent fleeing Jewish refugees back into the clutches of the Nazis. So what exactly is going on here? Why is no one calling on Saudi Arabia and all the other Muslim countries and nations in the Middle East to come out with the loudest protests and make every possible effort to wipe out this cancer once and for all? Of course, when Saudis are victims of terrorism, they defend themselves, as is at the moment, but they do not do anything for the greater scheme of things. If a group of Jews would have beheaded a Muslim and publicized a videotape of the event, would the world be quiet? If a group of Americans would do that, would everyone be silent? The whole of Europe and beyond would be protesting and condemning such an act, and quite rightly demanding a full investigation and the severest punishment for those responsible. Yet the same is not true of the atrocities perpetrated by Muslim extremists. If you ask most journalists, who have of course great influence on the public perception of events, they'll answer with all the usual distorted nonsense. Top of the list is of course the favorite scapegoat, Israel. If Israel did this and if Israel did that, we wouldn't have all these problems. The Arab world and their left-wing loony supporters claim that America leans unfairly towards Israel. If only America wasn't so supportive of Israel and its occupation, the Arab world would respond, is their mistaken belief. Did they respond when the Oslo Agreement offered the Palestinians almost everything they wanted? Oh, if only Israel would no longer exist, terrorism all over the world would cease overnight, is what they would have us believe. It's laughable if it weren't so ridiculous. Whoever came up with the idea to call Israel's presence occupation should be commended. It's a great PR line because it sounds so offensive, so unjust, so anti-freedom. Could any fair-minded person support unending occupation? Of course not. But my journalist colleagues conveniently forget that the West Bank and Gaza are not occupied territories, but disputed territories, just like Kashmir and other places in the world, even Taiwan. Human rights groups and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have also contributed significantly to the distortion of events and the demonization of Israel. While undoubtedly Israel's anti-terror operations in Gaza have caused hardship to part of the Palestinian population there, the one-sided public relations activities of these NGOs continue to undermine the effort to advance a global human rights agenda due to a transparent politicization. But the PR machine rolls on relentlessly. And we are influenced by it. We talk of so-called militants, freedom fighters, and religious leaders, all distorted, nice-sounding names for people who are in effect cruel terrorists, out to incite, to kill, or kill themselves as many innocent civilians as possible. Was the so-called religious leader Abu Hamza living in deprived circumstances? Was his quality of life
In England,
affected by Israeli occupation?
before he was extradited to the United States. Stay tuned, there's more.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Were the murderers of engineer Nicholas Berg and journalist Daniel Pearl also oppressed by the West? And what about those mass executioners who destroyed the World Trade Center and part of the Pentagon and unsuccessfully aimed at the White House? Were they also torn away from their olive groves and beautiful gardens in the Holy Land? Most of them were Saudis. Perhaps the true cause why we don't hear outrage against the attacks on innocent civilians in the Middle East could be ascribed to the success of the power of terrorism and its intimidating effect. It so lowers the resolve that we begin to find it acceptable, like an abused wife who becomes so desensitized and detached that she denies or minimizes her husband's beatings. The carnage has tragically become so routine, so common, that we just dismiss it. Instead of outrage and anger, we accept it as just another day in the Middle East. Until it is too late. It's chillingly reminiscent of Hitler, who deliberately convinced the world that the only way to deal with his madness was to appease him. Hitler kept promising and then betraying, again and again, until the world caught on. Remember Chamberlain, who infamously declared peace in our time as he was waving the paper sacrificing the Sudetenland to Germany? And not long after, the Nazis brazenly marched into Poland. It took Churchill to remind Britain that appeasement is feeding the sharks. Will we wake up to today's reality when it is too late? Let me put it bluntly. The Muslim Arab world has produced and continues to produce murderers who in the name of religion feel neither guilt nor have moral scruples to brutalize innocent people into submission. Don't get me wrong, there's no doubt that the majority of Muslims and Arabs would want to be peace-loving if their corrupt leaders would not brainwash them so that they can line their pockets. Look at Arafat and his millions, stolen from the monies contributed by the European Union for the Palestinian people's welfare. But of course one could argue similarly for the majority of Germans during World War II. Yet we hold them collectively responsible for allowing the Nazis to come to power. In face of the genocide and atrocities that took place while they looked on, even their silence was a crime. The Middle East is a breeding ground for terrorism and for genocide, and Palestinian schools are indoctrinating the children that Jews are pigs and monkeys, and with ideas of jihad, martyrdom, to become suicide bombers is the highest ideal, the greatest honor, and the certain and most direct way to paradise. Whilst our ideal is to maintain life, they glorify death. Is the reason that we are so reluctant to act perhaps the oil? Or is it too unsettling to realize that we are facing a clash of civilizations between Islam and what they call the infidels? Those who profess to live according to God's law must demonstrate it by respecting their fellow humans, whoever they are. Jews have just celebrated the festival of Shavuot, when we relived the revelation at Sinai and the giving of the commandments, accepted by the whole world as the pattern of behavior. This indeed is an appropriate time to demand accountability of the Arab and Muslim world for their actions, to demand honest and unbiased reporting by the media, and to call on a civilized world to take a firm stand against terrorism and to defend honesty, decency and integrity before it is too late. The arrest of an Arab provided police with information confirming PA ambulances are used to transport PA, that's Palestinian Authority officials and members of the Palestinian Force 17 security force, across IDF checkpoints, and that way avoid inspections. In some cases, persons were hooked on IVs and monitoring equipment to appear as genuinely ill persons being transported in the ambulances. Police also suspect that the same ambulances are also used to smuggle weapons past checkpoints. The abuse of international standard is once again documented at a time when the global community points an accusing finger at the IDF's so-called human rights violations. The international community, however, continues to ignore the fact that terrorists position themselves and work out of residential areas, placing innocent persons in the line of fire. All this in addition to a long record of using Red Crescent ambulances for illegitimate transports, including drive-by shootings.
That was a commentary from some 15 years ago. Apart from the Abraham Accords, has there really been much change with our Palestinian Arab neighbors? Now a word about the Biden border madness. Although they will not admit it, turning President Trump's border policy on its head has created arguably the greatest crisis since the Democrats took power. Security to prevent illegal infiltrators at the Mexican border, which Trump's border wall and fence had almost fully completed, was halted by Biden. To put it in a nutshell, Biden argued that it is inhumane not to allow entry into the U.S. to people who are fleeing from countries where their economic situation prevents them from having quality of life. That message was well understood by the underprivileged masses of Central America's Northern Triangle and beyond, as an invitation to flood to the border, overwhelming border security. Parents send their children unaccompanied or with strangers in the hope to be able to be admitted legally later for compassionate reasons. No COVID tests were carried out, and the latest available figures show that 18,000 children are accommodated in camps on the U.S. side of the Mexican border, 700 to 1,200% over capacity in the various establishments. Rumor has it that the same infants were reused by different adults as a prop to allow them to enter. So instead of alleviating the alleged inhumane conditions in their countries of origin, Biden's policy created the most inhumane situation imaginable on the U.S. side of the Mexican border, far worse than that of which he accused Trump. Today, camps and compounds are larger and vastly overcrowded. Neither Biden nor his Vice President Kamala Harris have yet visited the Mexican border. Last week, members of Congress visited those facilities and had to check their telephones at the door to prevent pictures showing that the Biden officials were ashamed of what they had to deal with. When the media was finally allowed into the camps, their cameras recorded what can only be described as a catastrophe. President Biden, probably at the end of his tether, has passed the responsibility to sort out the mess to his Vice President Kamala Harris, without the necessity to consult with or refer to him. Yet, she believes that it can be solved diplomatically with the countries concerned, rather than by closing the border. I don't believe Harris has any intention to halt the flow of immigrants because she is on record expressing support for open borders. Could it be that the policy of accepting the illegals would make them inclined to support the Democrats in gratitude once they qualify to vote? And the radical wing of the House Democrats have expressed their intention to legislate for those granted asylum to be able to vote. President Biden's predicament reminds me of Goethe's poem The Sorcerer's Apprentice, who knew the formula to get the broomsticks to carry water for his bath, but forgot the one to stop them when the bath was full, and so caused a flood until his master's return. It's an open secret that embedded among the infiltrators are many undesirables like drug traders, gang members, prostitutes and their handlers, the categories that President Trump largely managed to keep out. The so-called children include a large percentage of 17-year-old adolescents susceptible to fall prey to gangs. In the US, as everywhere, the COVID restrictions caused a great deal of unemployment, and when the demand for unskilled labor returns, it will be the illegals who will be employed because they work for far less than the official minimum wage, while many American workers will be ignored. Another nail in the coffin of the already deflated US economy, because the major part of the illegals' wages will be sent to their home country to support their families rather than being spent locally. Oh, there's one more thing. The powerful teachers' union has been holding the country to ransom. For months they are on strike, resulting in children being forced into continued unnecessary homeschooling. But guess what? They are volunteering to hold classes for the alien children at the border, where there is a high percentage of COVID infection. And COVID infection is the reason they stayed away from American schools. That defies all reason and is tantamount to the Biden administration imposing self-inflicted wounds on their country. Tommy Laren, conservative political commentator, visited the border, and here is her reply to the claims of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the radical socialist congresswoman, who said this:
First of all, anyone who's using the term surge around you consciously is trying to invoke a militaristic frame. This is not a surge. These are children, and they are not insurgents, and we are not invaded.
The typical radical socialist view that is far removed from what was the mainstream Democratic Party. Don't move the dial. After this break, you will hear the well-argued reply by Tommy Laren.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Tommy Laren, conservative political commentator, visited the border, and here is her reply to the claims of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the radical socialist congresswoman, who said this:
First of all, this is not a surge. These are children, and they are not insurgents, and we are not invaded.
Yeah, well, I would have to disagree with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We are being invaded. When you have hundreds of thousands of people coming over every month, set to reach 1 million this year, that is an invasion. And of course, everybody looks at those images from these detention facilities and feels very badly for those individuals. Nobody would want to be in that position. But I will tell you this, because I have visited those facilities. I have spent a lot of time with Border Patrol agents and those that are really tasked with their care. I know these images look bad. I know that that's not what anybody wants to see. But you have to understand, Border Patrol agents are being overwhelmed right now. They're being relegated to babysitters. They're not able to do their actual jobs, and they're doing the best that they can with the resources that they have. So we need to come together as a nation and decide how we're going to get Border Patrol better resources. But as John James said at the top of this block, what we really need to be doing is stop incentivizing people to come over here. These are children. Yes, they are absolutely. They're innocent children, but they're being incentivized to come over here. Their parents are sending them over here. They know that they will only be held for a certain amount of days, possibly move to a convention center, be given schooling, housing, and then they'll be released into the shadows, and then eventually the parents will be allowed to come right along with them if they're not already in this country. So we have to stop incentivizing it. But I will disagree with some of the points that were made as far as that nobody has tackled this problem. Donald J. Trump tackled this problem. His zero tolerance policy, his policy that said, do not come over here. If you do not want to be separated, do not cross that border illegally. Do not come. We are building a wall. We are taking immigration seriously. We have every right to protect and defend the integrity of our border. That was working. Then the Biden administration came in with their virtue signaling and threw that all away. And now everybody suffers. The migrant children suffer. The American taxpayer suffers. And we're in this dilemma that has no end in sight. But it has to start with securing the border.
Much of what President Trump achieved in economics and in international standing for the U.S. is being eroded by the weakness of his successor. That is so far the main achievement of the Biden administration. 75 million Trump voters hope that by the midterm elections next year, once the Biden taxation policy has been announced, many more of the electorate will realize that they were duped in many respects and will vote to overturn the composition of the Senate and the Democrat majority of the House of Representatives. Trump supporters are also looking forward to again regularly hear the comments and views of President Trump, who is about to open his own social media platform in the near future. He has already established a website, www.45office.com, where he and his wife Melania can be contacted. The Americans are a strange lot. In their eagerness to preserve personal freedom, they quote the most inappropriate comparison of the yellow star that had been worn by Jews in the Nazi era in preparation of their murder, with the requirements to show a so-called green passport proving vaccination against COVID, which would be required to enter public venues, etc. Yet they are quite happy to show their ID, usually in the form of the driving license, when going to vote or as general identification. Do they not realize that protection against the COVID pandemic is in their own interest? Apart from politics, the whole of America is concentrated on the much-anticipated trial in Minneapolis of police officer Derek Chauvin, allegedly concerned in the death of George Floyd. Most Americans are aware of the circumstances of his arrest and the 8 minute 46 seconds that he was held under the knee of Chauvin and Floyd's subsequent death. A strong case for the prosecution, who began by showing that video of the event. In their opening statement, the defense concentrated on the fact that Floyd was under the influence of drugs when he resisted arrest and that his pre-existing coronary condition caused shortness of breath. That, combined with the drugs in his system, caused the death and not the knee of Officer Chauvin. They also mentioned reasonable doubt. That, in the view of the eminent defense lawyer Alan Dershowitz, was an important error. The emphasis should be only on innocence and not until the final statement should they bring in the concept of reasonable doubt. The trial is in the early stage and it's expected to last for up to a month. It was a mistake to hold the trial in Minneapolis, the city in which this high-profile case occurred. Because the case has already been tried by the media and by the black public, a local jury will be in grave danger if they decide to acquit the main defendant of even one of the three charges, the most severe of which is second-degree unintentional murder, which can carry a prison sentence of 40 years. The others carry 20, respectively 10 years in prison. The 14-person jury that took 3 weeks to select is made of 8 white, 4 black, and 2 multicultural men and women, who are all placed in a very difficult situation to make their judgment purely on the evidence. Whichever way they decide, they will be open to threats on their life. One of the consequences of the death of Floyd is an obsession to defund and reform the police. So the New York Governor Cuomo ordered municipalities to submit police reform plans to the state by April the 1st. When Ithaca and Tompkins County were looking for a suitable person to sit on their panel to advise on re-imaging their police force, they selected Richard Rivera. Is he a lawyer, a psychologist, a social worker, or another upright citizen? No. Rivera is a homeless convicted killer who in 1981 murdered the New York police officer Robert Walsh. He was given parole after serving 39 years of his life sentence in prison. Ithaca and Tompkins County choose a fox to guard the chicken shed. That is the philosophy that guides the American Socialist New Order. It's the ultimate disrespect to the service of Officer Walsh. Pat Lynch, president of the Police Benevolent Association, said Rivera is the last person who should be doling out advice on police reform. It's outrageous and despicable, he said. Not only did this cop killer get paroled, but now he gets a seat at the table to help dismantle a police department. Did anybody expect him to be fair and open-minded in his reviews? Said Pat Lynch. If you don't know it already, the world is envious of Israel's success in handling the COVID pandemic. 5,228,324 Israelis have received the first dose of the corona vaccine, and 4,741,946 have to date already received the second dose. The infection coefficient stands at 0.53, and only 356 new cases were reported at the beginning of the week. It is possible, however, that following the Passover festivities, there may be a temporary, discernible rise in cases. Despite the problems encountered with several population groups and the rhetoric of the crazy anti-vaxxers, Israel's population has been fairly good in following the instructions of masks and social distancing, which has paid off. Many facilities have been allowed to open, and as all stores that survived the lockdown have reopened, the streets are again back to normal. If our population maintains its discipline and does not act beyond what has been allowed, we shall, God willing, soon have overcome this long hiccup. It must be said loud and clear that despite the shortcomings of Prime Minister Netanyahu and calls for him to be replaced, it was his action and negotiation skill with the vaccine producers that procured Israel an early and adequate supply of vaccine so that the whole population over 16 years of age is able to receive vaccination. The next step, coming shortly, will be the vaccination of 1 million children of 12 years and over. Again, a first in the world. It is thought that the issue of green vaccination certificates in Israel required to enter certain establishments would encourage the doubters to get vaccinated, but that method seems to have been disbanded in light of the excellent results. Let's celebrate Israel's success with music. A Shabbos song from the album of the amazing Rebbetzin Tapp and Friends.
1, 2, 3, 4 items on the list.
5, 6, 7, 8 items on the list.
9, 10, 11, 12 items on the list.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
Well, we need some seltzer, some shampoo,
pretzel soup, nuts, crackers too. We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We're gonna shop before it's time to light.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We need apples, carrots, and some squash. Some gummy worms for Oneg Nosh.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We're gonna shop before it's time to light.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
Some pizza and olive oil.
Don't forget those tissues and aluminum foil.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We're gonna shop before it's time to light.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We need bug-free salad, apple juice,
pickles, hummus, and baba ganoush.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We're gonna shop before it's time to light.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
Shabbos
and Shabbat Shalom.
It's time to pay and get on home.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal tonight.
We're gonna shop before it's time to light.
We're gonna shop for the Shabbos meal
tonight. This day, April the 2nd, is the birthday of several interesting people. The amorous adventurer Giovanni Casanova was born in 1725. Hans Christian Andersen, the writer of fairy tales, saw the light of day in 1805. The novelist Emile Zola was born 181 years ago in 1840, and the composer Sergei Rachmaninoff in 1873. And with that trivia, I am once again at the end of the program for today. I do hope that you enjoy the Passover festival that ends tomorrow night. But our Christian friends are about to celebrate Easter, the most important event in the Christian calendar. So I wish all a happy celebration, and may it bring peace to the troubled world. Until the next time, this is Walter Bingham, hoping that all my listeners have a productive and safe week. I also hope that you don't forget to assist your elderly neighbor. Goodbye.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.